Have you ever actually looked into ray tracing or tested ray tracing inside some games and actually thought, whoa, what a gimmick? Why should I lose lots of performance for almost no visual fidelity improvement? In some scenarios, the visual fidelity improvements from using ray tracing or path tracing, which we can call the real ray tracing, are really good. For example, in games like Control, in games that we know now, for example like Cyberpunk 2077, in other games, let's say like The Ascent, the visual fidelity does improve a lot with ray tracing and especially with path tracing. And some of you of course will say that you can't really notice the difference in between rasterization, which is the normal method been using for decades, between rasterization, ray tracing and path tracing. Of course you will! There are people that can't notice the difference in between 60 and 120 Hz. And they are actually receiving double the frames per second in their eyes and they can't notice the difference. The thing is that your brain adapts, and the same happens to rasterization, ray tracing and path tracing. If you change from rasterization to path tracing, you will be like, oh man, this looks so realistic, this is insane. But as soon as you start playing the game with path tracing for let's say half an hour, your brain will adapt and you won't get that whoa feeling anymore. But as soon as you turn the settings down and go to rasterization once again, you'll notice that the lighting is so fake compared to path tracing, it just doesn't feel right. And although your brain adapts, as soon as you change, you can definitely notice the difference. The same happens, for example, when you are used to, let's say, a 24 inches monitor. As soon as you change to a bigger monitor, let's say 32 inches, 34 inches, as soon as you change, you get that whoa feeling. In let's say some hours that whoa feeling goes away, but as soon as you try to use the 24 inches monitor that you had before, you'll be like, whoa, this is so small. And the same happens with this, the same happens with the size, the same happens with rasterization, ray tracing and path tracing. And once again, it is not that some people can't notice it, it is more like some people don't know where to look. And that's exactly the purpose of this video, to show you the difference in between rasterization, ray tracing and path tracing in several scenarios, with me commenting each particular scenario or each particular point, telling you this or that, look at this, look at that, because that's the difference. But once again, you might say, if you actually need to look twice or you need Steele's image to actually tell the difference, it is because it is not worth it. But I can tell you right now that in some scenarios, you don't need to look much, because you can definitely, and I repeat, definitely tell the difference. And with this all said, let's go to the comparisons. But before, today's video sponsor is GVG Mode, bringing you all the software deals you need, like Windows 10, Windows 11, Office 2021 with a new Windows 11 design, and even Windows Server 2022. For all of these, you can use my SKG discount code for 25% off, getting a Windows 10 serial key for only $16. Then use the key on your Windows settings and you'll have an activated system. Firstly, we have rasterization in this darker scene. Now we have ray tracing. And now path tracing. That isn't that much different in the scenario. At least, that's what it seems. Let's start with rasterization versus normal ray tracing in static images, and you can immediately see that with ray tracing, shadows are much softer and the image is darker. In this particular scenario, the most noticeable difference is in the reservoir part, where ray tracing delivers a much smoother and more accurate shadow drawing alongside better ambient occlusion, which of course makes sense since the reservoir is covered by a roof and it's nighttime. In the scenario, the difference is minimal though, with once again softer shadows created by the barn, with none of them in the roof compared to rasterization, and of course slightly better quality on the windows of the house as well. Although seeing statics of ray tracing versus path tracing, we can already see the huge difference in between them. Firstly, the reservoir part is much darker than with normal ray tracing, with much less light coming in, which makes sense if you think about it, as the barn is actually closed, so very little light comes in from the edges of the wood. And since we have less light and much better ambient occlusion, the vegetation also looks much more realistic, and kind of more grounded as well, with the bottom of it being much darker since the light won't pass through all the leaves. Another thing we can notice is the inside of the house with light coming out of the window, and of course the ambient occlusion of the iron supports and the upper stairs, but of course these are nothing really relevant. Now we have an inside scene, with rasterization coming first, then ray tracing ultra, and now path tracing, where you can immediately notice the differences. Starting with the stills from rasterization to ray tracing ultra, the differences are there but not really relevant. In this case it's mostly the ambient occlusion and the reflections that make the difference, with better reflections on the right column being slightly more illuminated due to the light source on the left, and overall that's it, with only slightly better ambient occlusion in things like weapons, objects around, and so on. It is when we go from the normal ray tracing to the path tracing that we see a substantial difference in terms of overall quality in this scene. In here the lighting is much more realistic with path tracing, with the character's face and chest mostly covered by shadows, as the light source is actually behind him and not at his side. Looking at the ground, we can see that the light is also much better diffused, with a smoother transition in between the light and shadow, and of course with some light bouncing as well to the side of the column. And besides that, we also have better ambient occlusion here, with the column on the left being much darker with path tracing, while the iron bars in the front, well, they still reflect some light, making things kind of more realistic. Well, at least in my eyes. And now in the garage scene, one of the most interesting and relevant scenes for path tracing. That scene completely transforms the final image. Starting with rasterization and Artic stills, we can see that ray tracing does a better job, but absolutely not worth the performance drop. In here we do have ray tracing delivering softer shadows for the wheel carts, while also delivering better occlusion for the shelves, but at the same time it kind of somehow eliminates the distinction in between the two floor patterns, something that obviously shouldn't happen. With the same thing happening to the white line close to the cables that simply vanishes when using ray tracing. In terms of the car itself, ray tracing does have better occlusion, but if you ask me, in this particular scene, I still prefer rasterization, as although the shadow length with ray tracing seems more accurate, I don't really believe it should be as blurry as it is. I do believe that in this particular scene, the best scenario would be a better tweaked rasterization, as it would look much better. But when we move from ray tracing to path tracing, we have a massive change in the scenario. In here, I can't really say that this scene is more or less realistic, as the scenario would depend on the amount of light passing through the glass in the roof. But if we were to talk about a very sunny day, let's say, path tracing does deliver a much more enjoyable experience, with the car being much brighter considering we have two powerful light sources on the top, and with even the ambient inside the whole garage looking much brighter due to the sunlight bouncing between objects. Like for example the wheel cart, that is much brighter now since it has a light source right on top of it, and although the lines in between the different floors are still gone, the overall lighting just feels much better, as the image also gets a warmer tone due to the sunlight entering from the rooftop windows. I mean, even the car's elevator is much brighter since we have light bouncing inside the garage, not even mentioning the difference in the roof lighting, which is also amazing. And this is another interesting scene here, with rasterization versus ray tracing versus path tracing, with the stills showing us that there are once again very few differences in between rasterization and ray tracing. In this case, ray tracing does deliver better reflections on the top of the car, alongside slightly better ambient occlusion, and of course better shadows as seen here. Although the biggest difference is once again when going from ray tracing to path tracing, and even in this scenario you can't really tell the differences unless you're specifically looking for them. Being the bigger ones here, the better ambient occlusion down the stairs, but most importantly the blue light bouncing to the wall in the top of the building, something less noticeable with normal ray tracing. And rasterization and ray tracing are so bad in this particular scene that the car has absolutely no shadow, even though there's light sources in the opposite way. With path tracing though, we do have shadow and better ambient occlusion, something that makes the car feel much more realistic and grounded. Definitely a lack of optimization in this specific scene. On the other hand, path tracing has some shimmering issues in this particular scene as well, which is understandable as this is a preview technology. And in this AC shadow, by the way, I believe ray tracing is more realistic, as there aren't many light sources to make it look brighter on our side. unless of course this happens due to the moonlight. Who knows? Now with an under the bridge scene, once again with rasterization versus ray tracing versus path tracing. Looking at the stills, the difference in between rasterization and ray tracing doesn't seem to be that much once again, but when we are looking at them side by side, we can see that the ray tracing does make the ambient occlusion considerably better, or at least makes it more consistent, especially when you look at the vegetation. Still not worth the performance cost over rasterization. But path tracing on the other hand, even though it doesn't seem like it, is a whole new level. As you can see, the scene is much darker on the left portion of the image, exactly as it should be since we're talking about an ambient with almost no light. If you look at the light of the ceiling, it doesn't show anymore the blue tone from the light source on the right, which is correct as we have a beam preventing the blue light from coming to the left side. On the other hand, the right side of the image gets a more bluish tone since the light source is exactly on that side. And of course the vegetation is also brighter when closer to the light source and darker when further from it. And to finalize the quality comparisons, we have the last scene, nighttime and outside, and this makes sense since this is where most of the gameplay will happen. In this case of rasterization versus ray tracing, I do have some bittersweet opinions. First of all, ray tracing has better reflections here in both cars, better ambient occlusion, like in the front car that has a much brighter bottom shadow since direct light is going into it, and better shadows, like the ones you see caused by our car's headlights on the street rails, something that's not presented with rasterization. Although, when we look at the street up front, we get an over-reflective surface, which doesn't really make much sense since it wasn't raining before and the worn-out tar isn't reflective at all. As for path tracing, it is still pretty noticeable, but not as much as before. In here we have once again softer shadows, with the shadows cast in the left side of the front car being slightly lighter, as we do have a light source on the left pillar, but sadly the road is still over-reflective like it is with normal ray tracing. In the back of the car we have a small difference, which is the red backlight that also illuminates the bottom panel, looking much more realistic. And we have way less light from the headlights passing through the right side, or to the right side, sorry, as the light itself is being slightly stopped by the sidewalk and bushes. Although I believe that this part is more a matter of taste than a matter of realism. But what about the performance? What about the FPS numbers? Will they go downhill as well because we're having a huge increase in some scenarios in terms of visual fidelity? Will we have a huge impact in our NVIDIA or AMD cards? Or will we have a minimal impact that will actually allow us to still play the game with ray tracing or path tracing if we compromise in some scenarios like the DLSS and frame generation? Let's see. Let's start with the cell/prisoner scene at 1440p ultra settings using FSR/DLSS in quality mode. We can immediately see that with rasterization, which is a normal method, the RX 7900 XTX is 35% faster than the RTX 4070 Ti, which is quite normal, but as soon as we enable ray tracing, the RTX 4070 Ti outmatches the RX 7900 XTX by 26%. Not even mentioning that AMD's flagship can't even achieve 30 average FPS when running path tracing, while the RTX 4070 Ti goes up to 55, being a massive 97% faster. Let me just remind you that with the vast majority of games, the RX 7900 XTX will equal the 4070 Ti's performance in ray tracing, and in some rare scenarios like Resident Evil 4 or Far Cry 6, it will even beat the RTX 4080, with Cyberpunk 2077 being one of the best case scenarios for the NVIDIA cards. But even with that said, as of today, Cyberpunk 2077 still does not support the recently released FSR3 from AMD, so all we can test here is the frame generation from NVIDIA, that actually works very well, even in lower FPS scenarios. With frame generation, the RTX 4070 Ti is now outmatching the RX 7900 XTX even in rasterization, being also 94% faster in normal ray tracing and over 3 times faster in path tracing, delivering 92.8 average FPS versus the 28 average FPS with the RX 7900 XTX. In the outside car scene, we have once again the AMD card being considerably faster in rasterization, which is no surprise as it is a tier above both in general performance and pricing. But as soon as we move to ray tracing, it gets stomped by the little RTX 4070 Ti that is now 37% faster. Taking things even further when we go to path tracing, where it is 2.5 times faster than AMD's flagship, actually delivering a playable experience. Experience that gets even better as we enable frame generation that makes the RTX 4070 Ti achieve a smooth 87 average FPS, while the RX 7900 XT barely achieves 20, with the RTX 4070 Ti delivering a much better experience, even being a lower tier card. And now we have the garage scene, one that massively changes when using path tracing. We have once again the RX 7900 XTX being much faster in terms of rasterization, in this case 38%, but being outmatched by 19% in ray tracing and 90% in path tracing. 90%. With things improving for the NVIDIA GPU as soon as we enable frame generation, that, for example, when using path tracing, delivers a 67% performance increase over the base values, that leads to a 319% of the RX 7900 XTX performance over 3 times faster. And well guys, I guess that's all. As you saw, we do have huge visual fidelity improvements in some scenarios, in some others not really, so it depends on the scenario you're looking at. In some scenarios, rasterization is actually the best because it has no movement artifacts, it has no visual artifacts whatsoever. In some scenarios, ray tracing and path tracing have some shimmering, and that's due to the technology itself. As soon as you enable rasterization, that shimmering or those parts of shimmering go away. So that's a thing of ray tracing and especially path tracing in some scenarios, because path tracing once again is still in technical preview. Now, is it really worth to use ray tracing or path tracing in Cyberpunk 2077? I must tell you that Cyberpunk 2077 is one of the heaviest games in terms of ray tracing and path tracing especially. So some other games, when you actually enable ray tracing, even older games like Control that have a very good ray tracing implementation, even the AMD cards can actually use that ray tracing implementation pretty well, okay? They will perform much lower, or they will perform much worse in this case than the NVIDIA counterparts, but they can still, even more the 7000 series, they can still perform decently well in those scenarios. And in some other ray tracing titles, some lighter ray tracing titles, once again, like Resident Evil 4, Far Cry 6 and some others, the AMD cards can still perform very well. Cyberpunk 2077 is a really heavy game in terms of ray tracing and path tracing, but in my opinion, if you can play it with path tracing, just do it, because it is a completely different experience in some scenarios. It looks much better overall. Now, the developers could make rasterization look much better. Definitely they could. They could, because mods already do it. You don't have ray tracing on the mods, and yet they can make rasterization look much better. For example, if I'm not mistaken, Counter-Strike 2 developers, they actually used ray tracing to map the shadows and then use those shadows and reflections and so on in rasterization. So they basically used ray tracing to kind of emulate what they would need, and then they kind of ported it to rasterization, which was actually a pretty interesting move. So that's a thing that developers could do. That's a thing that actually modders do as well. For example, you can find some mods for Cyberpunk 2077 that enhance the rasterization quality by a lot, and I'll actually make a video about it, because these mods will make rasterization look much better while performing much better as well than ray tracing, which is a win-win situation for most users. Now, once again, if you have a GPU that supports path tracing, that can run path tracing on the Cyberpunk 2077, like let's say the 4070 Ti, 4080, 4090, then do it. If not, well, you can use the normal ray tracing, because almost all NVIDIA cards can do the normal ray tracing well, decently well, as soon as you enable the LSS, which is not optimal, but at least you can do it. And even the top tier AMD cards can do ray tracing well, decently well once again as soon as they enable FSR 2.1, and as soon as FSR 3 gets released for Cyberpunk 2077, I believe that those cards will perform even better, even more when we're talking about ray tracing and path tracing especially. Although AMD cards won't really work that well with path tracing, because even if we take off the bugs that they have in terms of lighting in some scenarios, even there, the performance is just not there. Even if you use frame generation and so on, the performance, the base performance is just not there, as the 4070 Ti is much faster than the 7900 XTX in terms of path tracing. But once again, Cyberpunk 2077 is NVIDIA's poster boy, so it is what it is. And well guys, that's all for today's video. Thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share this video, and don't forget to leave your comment in the comment section and let me know what you think about these results. If you think ray tracing is actually worth it over rasterization, or if path tracing is actually worth it over ray tracing. In my opinion, rasterization or path tracing. Ray tracing is just not worth the performance drop for a minimal visual fidelity improvement. Or you use the rasterization, or you use the path tracing. That's my opinion. Thanks a lot for watching, once again comment section, and see you in the next video. Cheers!